In the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, a lock of grey hair sat in a drawer for 2.5 centuries. In the private keeping of the Earl of Portsmouth, descended from Newton's own family, there was more of it. In a London sale room in 1936, the auction house of Sotheby's put 329 lots of Isaac Newton's handwriting under the hammer, and more than a third of it was alchemy. And today, in a digital archive at Indiana University Bloomington, scholars are still working their way through roughly 1 million words that Newton wrote and transcribed on that one subject, of which only a tiny fraction has ever been published. Everything you were taught about the founder of modern physics was assembled by leaving things out. In 1979, 4 strands of his hair proved it chemically. The mercury reading came back at 197 parts per million. A normal figure sits somewhere near 5.1. To give that number a shape, the researchers set it beside a documented household accident in which a schoolboy brought home a quantity of mercury, spilled it, and the family began to suffer tremors and flaking skin. The mother of that family, the one who went on to experience hallucinations, tested at 141. Newton was higher. The figure was so far outside expectation that the first serious response in print was not to reconsider Newton. It was to ask whether the hair could possibly be his. If those 4 strands are genuine, then the most celebrated rational mind in human history spent decades quietly poisoning himself behind a locked door, and the story of how science began is not the story we have been telling. Now, let's talk about what the hair actually recorded. To understand what was found in 1979, you have to understand what was already sitting in the archives, ignored. There is a project at Indiana University Bloomington called The Chemistry of Isaac Newton. That spelling is not a mistake. Chemistry, with a Y, is the 17th century English word, and the project uses it deliberately. The project has been running for 2 decades under General Editor William Newman, with support from the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and its purpose is to edit and publish Newton's alchemical writing, most of which had never been edited by anyone. The scale of it is the part that stops people. Roughly 1 million words, laboratory notebooks, alphabetical indices of alchemical substances, page after page of Newton copying out other alchemists in his own hand. And the project does something most textual scholarship cannot. It takes Newton's procedures into a modern laboratory and runs them, using whether a reconstruction succeeds or fails as a way of checking whether we have correctly understood what he wrote 300 years ago. Everyone involved understood what was at stake. If this material was what it appeared to be, it would not adjust the picture of Newton, it would replace it. But manuscripts are paper, and paper can always be argued with. A defender can say the copying was scholarly curiosity. A defender can say he was reading alchemy the way a historian reads it, from the outside, at a safe distance. For 200 years, that is roughly what was said. In 1979, 2 men went looking for something that could not be argued with. The first thing the hair gave up was not a diagnosis. It was an inventory. A chemist named Pounds and a historian named Spargo wrote letters to Newton's descendants and to the keepers of Newton relics, asking whether any hair survived. They later admitted the search proved rather easier than expected. Several locks were located, 2 held by the Earl of Portsmouth and others in the library at Trinity College, and in both cases the owners responded warmly. 4 hairs came back. Those hairs went into a nuclear reactor. Neutron activation analysis works by bombarding a sample with neutrons until the atoms inside it become briefly radioactive, and every element gives off its own distinct signature as it settles. You do not need to know what you are looking for. You ask the sample what it contains, and it tells you. Paired with atomic absorption spectrophotometry, the results were not subtle. Abnormally high concentrations of chlorine, of gold, of arsenic, of antimony, of lead, and of mercury. That is not a human being's chemistry. That is a laboratory bench. Think of it like this. Hair grows outward from the root at roughly 1 centimeter a month, and whatever happens to be circulating in the blood at the moment a segment of that strand is being formed gets locked into the keratin as it hardens. It does not wash out. It does not fade. The strand is a slow tape recorder, running continuously, writing whatever passes through the body into a permanent line, and then carrying that line away from the scalp at a fixed speed. It cannot be persuaded. It has no interest in a man's reputation, and it keeps running long after he has decided what he would prefer the world to know. It was a record he never meant to leave. But contamination can explain a chemist's hands. It cannot explain what Newton had been doing with his mouth. because buried in the notebooks was a habit that nobody had thought to count. Spargo and Pounds went through Newton's laboratory records and tallied the number of times he described tasting the products of his own experiments. The figure they arrived at was 108 separate occasions. He kept notes on the flavors: tasteless, sweetish, saltish. On one occasion, he recorded something as having a strong, styptic, vitriolic taste. At the end of a run involving mercury, he described the product as strong, sourish, ungrateful. He was not being reckless in the way a young man is reckless. He was being empirical. Taste was one of the few analytical instruments a 17th century investigator actually had, and Newton used the instrument he had again and again and again. And the tasting was only the route he chose deliberately. The other route he took without noticing. Many of his experiments involved heating metals until they turned volatile, which is a polite way of saying he was filling a small, unventilated room with heavy metal vapor. He worked deep into the night. His contemporaries described him falling asleep beside a bubbling retort rather than leaving it. There is a medical term for what chronic exposure to mercury does to the mind rather than the body. It is called erethism, and I will come back to it because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. For now, one detail. Newton's Cambridge roommate John Wickens recalled that Newton's hair had turned gray by the age of 30, and that Newton joked about the cause. He blamed his own experiments with quicksilver. He knew, he told it as a joke. Another record he never meant to leave. And in the autumn of 1693, the record stopped being chemical and started being handwritten, because the most disturbing evidence in this story was never in a laboratory at all. Somewhere in 1692, something in Isaac Newton came apart, and by the following year, it was unmistakable. He broke with associates, he accused friends of conspiring against him, he barely slept, he reported conversations that had never taken place. In September of 1693, at the age of 50, he wrote to a colleague to say that he had neither eaten nor slept well for 12 months, that he had lost his former consistency of mind, and that he intended to withdraw from the man's acquaintance and see none of his friends again. In the same period, he wrote to the philosopher John Locke and accused him of trying to embroil him with women. A month later, on the 15th of October, he tried to apologize. In that letter, he blamed a habit of sleeping too often by his fire, which he said had given him an ill habit of sleeping and a distemper, and he mentioned that he had not slept an hour a night for a fortnight, and for 5 nights running had not slept at all. Now here is erethism properly. Erethism is the neuropsychiatric form of chronic mercury poisoning. The clinical description in the toxicology reference the 1979 researchers were working from reads as follows: nervous irritability, a tendency to blush easily, a change of temperament which is often best reported not by the patient but by friends and family because the patient cannot see it, a tendency to avoid meeting friends, and unexplained outbursts of temper. Around it sit the broader signs of long-term mercury exposure: disturbance of the gut, loss of appetite, insomnia, morbid irritability, mental hyperactivity. Read that list, then read those letters again, and if the word erethism does not sound familiar, the illness will. Mercury compounds were once used in the felt hat trade, and the derangement it produced in the workers is the thing Lewis Carroll was drawing on when he wrote The Mad Hatter. Isaac Newton had built himself a hatter's workshop and then slept in it. Now, I want to be honest with you about the strongest objection, because it is a serious one and serious people have made it. Everything I have just described also looks exactly like depression. Newton's mother had died in 1689, and she may have been the only person he was genuinely close to. There is a story about manuscripts lost in a fire. He had failed to secure an administrative post. He had finished the Principia 5 years earlier, and it is not unreasonable to think that a man who has just explained the motion of the heavens might struggle to find the next morning's purpose. Any of that would flatten a person, and in 1980, the very journal that published the Mercury papers published a rebuttal. Ditchburn argued for the more prosaic reading, a fairly common depressive illness with no connection to Newton's chemistry at all, and challenged the case on 3 fronts: the symptom match, the exposure estimate, and the neutron activation results themselves, on the grounds that 4 hairs merely believed to be Newton's are not the same thing as 4 hairs proven to be his. Critics have also pointed out that Newton showed almost none of the classic mouth damage of mercury poisoning. He was said to have lost barely a tooth in his life. Those are real objections. Here's where they run into trouble. Erethism is specifically the version of mercury poisoning that presents in the mind rather than in the mouth, and it does not require the oral signs to be present. The timing sits directly on top of his most intense laboratory years, not before them and not after. And the argument did not die in 1980. It was still being fought in the same journal in 2008, in a paper arguing that the collapse of 1692 and 1693 was mercury, and not clinical depression after all. The diagnosis remains contested. The metals in the hair do not. And even if you set the poisoning aside entirely, the reason he was exposed is not in dispute. That reason turns out to be far larger than almost anyone assumed, because this was not a hobby he kept in a drawer. By volume, alchemy may have been the main work of Isaac Newton's life. Roughly 1 million words written and transcribed on the subject, more than a third of the 329 lots that Sotheby's put up in 1936. 2 substantial laboratory notebooks surviving in the Portsmouth collection at Cambridge, consisting almost entirely of procedural protocols, page after page of operations, with almost no indication anywhere of what he was actually trying to achieve. Take one manuscript out of the pile, the Index Chemicus, held at King's College, Cambridge. 96 folios, more than 30,000 words, almost 900 entries. It is an alphabetical reference guide to the entire literature of alchemy, cross-referenced, with definitions followed by lists of the authors and texts that discuss each term, some entries a single line and some running to short essays. When the historian Richard Westphal analyzed a portion of it, he counted 1,975 separate references. That is one document. There are hundreds. And then there is the detail that destroys the last available defense, which is the idea that the chemistry sat in a sealed compartment away from the real work. It does not. The laboratory notebook containing the first full description of Newton's discovery that white light is a mixture of immutable spectral colors, one of the foundational results in the history of optics, is filled with recipes elaborated from alchemical sources. Sober accounts of freezing and boiling sit on the page alongside Neptune's trident, Mercury's caducean rod, and the green lion. There is no wall. There was never a wall. A record he never meant to leave, in a quantity he could not destroy. Which raises the obvious question, the one almost nobody asks. If this was a third of the man's written output, why has nobody ever told you about it? So if Newton was never the pure rationalist, where did the pure rationalist come from? He was manufactured, deliberately, in stages, by people whose names we know. Stage 1, 1727. Within months of Newton's death, an executor named Thomas Pellet went through the papers deciding what could be published. On the flyleaf of one of the alchemical notebooks, he wrote his verdict in his own hand, dated the 25th of September. Not fit to be printed. That sentence is the founding act of the myth. Stage 2, the century that followed. For nearly 100 years after his death, the breakdown of 1693 was ignored or actively suppressed by his biographers, who felt no obligation to present Newton as anything other than the supremely rational being that his peers and a reverential public already believed him to be. Ask who that served. The Enlightenment was in the business of building a case, and a movement that has staked everything on reason cannot afford a founder who spent 30 years chasing the philosopher's stone. So the founder was edited. Stage 3, 1936, when the containment failed, Sotheby's published the catalog, the lots went up, and the scholarly world got a very unpleasant surprise. John Maynard Keynes bought a substantial share of them, read them, and delivered the judgment that has hung over Newton ever since. Not the first of the age of reason, he said, but the last of the magicians. Overnight, the exemplar of Enlightenment rationality became something nobody knew how to file, which brings us back to that word, chemistry. The Indiana Project uses the 17th century spelling for a reason, and it is the most important idea in this entire story. In Newton's England, there was no border between alchemy and chemistry. There was one activity with one name. The line we treat as obvious, the line with science on one side and superstition on the other, was drawn afterwards by us and then projected backwards onto a man who never had the option of standing on either side of it. Isaac Newton did not wander out of science and into magic. That frontier did not exist yet, which means the strangest thing about Newton is not that he was an alchemist. It is what his alchemy tells us about the story we have been telling ever since. Here is where the comfortable compromise collapses too. The usual settlement is to say that Newton had two sides, a rational one that gave us the Principia and a credulous one that wasted itself on gold. 2 decades of work, including physical replication of his procedures in a modern laboratory, points somewhere far less convenient.
Newman's conclusion is that Newton was neither an Enlightenment rationalist nor an irrational magus, but a precise experimenter who took the riddles of alchemy and put them to empirical test, and who used ideas drawn from those alchemical texts to real effect in his optical work. There is no watertight dam to be built between his chemistry and the rest of his science, because he never built one himself.
It was one method, one world, one man. There was never a moment when science stepped cleanly out of magic. There was never a first modern scientist. There was never a clean line at all, only a line drawn later by the winners in the place that flattered them most. And the two ideas we started with come back changed. Chemistry is no longer a quaint old spelling. It is the accurate word, and ours are the inaccurate ones. And erethism stops being a diagnosis and becomes an image. A man alone in an unventilated room, tasting the world to find out what it was made of, being slowly and invisibly damaged by the only instrument he had. Every era decides which of its ideas are respectable and which are not fit to be printed. Ours has already made that decision about something, and we do not get to know what. Those four hairs did not expose a flaw in Isaac Newton. They exposed a flaw in the story. So here is the thesis, plainly. The boundary between science and superstition is not a feature of nature. It is drawn backwards, by us, in hindsight, and Newton is the proof, because the finest scientific mind of his age stood on both sides of a line that had not been invented yet. And now the part that keeps this honest, because there are two things this does not mean. The first is that none of this rescues alchemy. Transmutation by fire does not work. Newton gave it something close to 30 years and he failed, and the failure was not small, and it was not secretly a success in disguise. Being wrong in an interesting way is still being wrong. The second is harder, and I want it said out loud. The mercury diagnosis is not settled. The provenance of that hair has been challenged since 1980, and the challenge has never been fully answered. 4 strands is a small sample. And the collapse of 1693 may have had ordinary human causes that no amount of chemistry can rule out. So the claim here is narrower than the headline and much harder to argue with. Mercury does not explain Isaac Newton, but the metals were in the hair, the tastings were in the notebooks, the million words are in the archive, and every one of those things was kept from us on purpose. Go back to that drawer in the Trinity College library. A lock of gray hair, sitting for 2.5 centuries inside an institution devoted to reason, quietly holding the chemical signature of everything that institution's founding story had edited out. Nobody was guarding it. Nobody had hidden it. It simply sat there, unreadable, waiting for somebody to build an instrument capable of asking it a question. That is the real subject of all of this, not Newton. Evidence outliving the story told about it and lasting long enough to meet a generation with better tools and fewer reasons to look away. The strange thing about a record you never meant to leave is that you do not get to choose when it is read, or by whom, or what they conclude. Newton's was 4 strands of hair and 1 million words he assumed would be burned. Somewhere in what we are keeping right now, without noticing, there is one of ours. What the next century makes of it is not up to us. What we choose to put in it still is.